Order. Question number 7, the Honourable Annette King.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Social Development. How much in real terms has government funding for Relationships Aotearoa changed since 2008?
The Honourable Tolley.
Mr Speaker, insofar as I have ministerial responsibility, baseline funding from the Ministry of Social Development for Relationships Aotearoa in 2007-8 was $3.1 million. In 2014-15, they received $3.8 million. In addition to this, Relationships Aotearoa have received around $13 million from MSD in one-off grants for recession funding, services and capability building during this time.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Well, in light of that answer, what CPI adjustments have the Ministry of Social Development made to its contract with Relationships Aotearoa in the past 7 years? Has it been 0, 1%, 2%?
The Honourable Tolley.
Mr Speaker,
Order. Mr
Speaker, I'm advised that the whole sector that MSD works with has had no inflation adjustment since 2010-11. However, if you look at the baseline funding that I've just enunciated, the 2007-8 funding of $3.1 million would, if you just listen, it's coming, would be the equivalent of $3.6 million in today's terms. Therefore, I repeat, they have received $3.8 million, which is more than that CPI adjustment.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Why did she state on TV1 recently that Relationships Aotearoa had received, quote, a number of one-off grants from the Ministry of Social Development, when in fact they had received one grant for their IT system and not towards delivering services?
Honourable Tolley.
Because the member's wrong. They have received a number. In fact, I can tell the member that they received just under $2.5 million in community response funding. That was 2 separate grants, I understand. They've received just over $9 million for Canterbury earthquake recovery services. And they have received $1.4 million for capability investment funding.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Why does she... Beg your pardon?
Order.
The member should take it.
Order. The member should just ask her supplementary.
Why does she continue to denigrate Relationships Aotearoa by claiming they've made no attempt to be financially sustainable when they have 1, reduced expenditure, 2, laid off around 46 people last year, while at the same time providing much needed services to earthquake-affected people in Canterbury?
Honourable Tolley.
Mr Speaker, I have made no comments that denigrate Relationships Aotearoa. But what I have said is that taxpayers' money, which is funding these organisations like Relationships Aotearoa, we have a duty, a responsibility to make sure that we get the services we are paying for. And Relationships Aotearoa has not fulfilled its contracts for quite some time. We also have a responsibility to make sure that these organisations can live within their budgets, and Relationships Aotearoa has run deficit budgets for the last 4 years. And in fact, this year there is a large deficit that we are not sure how they're going to be able to fund.
Supplementary question, Mr
Supplementary
Speaker.
Question, the Honourable Annette King.
Why has she and her office knifed Relationships Aotearoa publicly by leaking incorrect information to the media, while knowing that the government has cut $4.8 million off their budget since 2012?
Honourable Tolley.
Well, the member makes a number of assertions, none of which are correct. In fact, it is not true. I have not knifed them in the back. In fact, I met with the interim board this afternoon and we had a very constructive discussion, and negotiations are underway. That member needs to take a breath and go back to her sources, because they are dead wrong.
Question number 8, John O'Naylor.